This video sponsored by War Thunder. On the 2nd of March 1943, Lieutenant Commander Takahide Aoi was leading a formation of 21 A6M2 Zeros on a low-level strike mission, streaking just above the water towards their target, the town of Darwin in northern Australia. Having spotted the attackers on radar, the defending force was already airborne. 26 Supermarine Spitfires had scrambled from 3 airfields just inland and were climbing for altitude. The vicious air battle about to unfold over this remote region of the Commonwealth was the first of many that would occur over the next 8 months, as the two best dogfighters of the Second World War faced each other in a contest that most people have no idea even happened. So, who came out on top? Which combination of aircraft, training, weapons and tactics was superior? The best pilots on both sides, flying the most capable fighter aircraft their countries could offer, with only one objective: get the other guy before he gets you. Welcome to Dogfight, 1943, Duel over Darwin. Our story really begins a year and a half earlier, as 4 Japanese fleet carriers launched their surprise attack of around 242 aircraft in a bid to cripple Allied ships and port facilities. This attack, led by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, batted away the defending USAAF P-40 Warhawks with relative ease, devastating the port below. But this port wasn't Pearl Harbor, it was Darwin, the capital of Australia's Northern Territory. Yes, despite following the same template as the infamous attack on Pearl, this strike was 2 months later, on the 19th of February 1942. Port Darwin was almost completely destroyed, 30 aircraft were shot down or destroyed on the ground, 11 ships were sunk, and around 300 people died. The Japanese attackers lost just 3 pilots. This attack would be the first of around 100 Japanese air raids on the region. It became a genuine concern that Japan would try to occupy Northern Australia in much the same way they had smashed through the rest of the Pacific, so significant Allied resources soon arrived in the area, including the USAAF's 49th Fighter Group flying P-40E Warhawks. The American pilots were almost completely outmatched by the Japanese A6M3s they were flying against, but nonetheless, they were able to score some early victories on Japanese bombers and force the attackers to fly a lot higher to evade the P-40s below. In September 1942, the exhausted American pilots were transferred to New Guinea, replaced with 2 squadrons of Royal Australian Air Force P-40s, the 76th and 77th. Sporadic interceptions were made with some success, but this video isn't about the P-40 Warhawk. By late 1942, the Australian No. 1 fighter wing was now training just outside of Sydney, preparing to defend Darwin, and they flew Spitfires. The Vickers Supermarine Spitfire can trace its lineage to K5054, a prototype that first flew in March 1936. It used streamlined stress skin construction, a retractable undercarriage, and eventually 8 Browning 303 machine guns in its elliptical wings. K5054 was powered with a Rolls-Royce PV-12 engine, which would soon evolve into the iconic Merlin that would power the Spitfire, Hurricane, Mosquito and Lancaster for much of the war. It was a phenomenal aircraft, fast, agile and packing a punch, but it was difficult to manufacture at scale. Even by the Battle of Britain in 1940, the backbone of fighter command was the inferior Hawker Hurricane, the aircraft that would initially face off against Japanese Zeros in the skies over Singapore, Ceylon and Java in 1942. So it was only in 1943 that the Royal Australian Air Force would receive its first Spitfires, and there were a few reasons for this. Firstly, it had been assumed that Great Britain and the Royal Air Force would guarantee Australia's security. In return, the RAAF would provide Australian pilots and aircrew for use in the RAF as part of the Empire Air Training Scheme, EATS. The threat to Australia was remote after all. Then Singapore fell on the 15th of February 1942. 4 days later, Darwin was pounded by 250 Japanese aircraft, and the Aussies had no aircraft to defend themselves with. The Americans transferred P-39s and P-40s to the RAAF as a stopgap, while Australian diplomats lobbied both London and Washington for more capable fighters. Meeting with Prime Minister Winston Churchill on the 28th of May 1942, the Australian Minister for External Affairs managed to get the British PM to agree to providing no less than 3 squadrons of Spitfires to the RAAF, hereby known as the Churchill Wing. Very soon, 48 aircraft were bound for Melbourne, but in June, Axis forces captured Tobruk, and the decision was made to unload all but 6 of the Spitfires in West Africa to support operations in Egypt. The first 6 arrived in August, 2 per squadron. These are the aircraft on screen. It would be October before another batch of 64 aircraft finally arrived. So the Australians had asked for, and the British had sent, their best fighter aircraft, and the reason was largely the opponent, the Mitsubishi A6M2 Zero. The A6M was born from a Japanese naval specification to replace the A5M and first flew in April 1939. It was designed from the ground up as a carrier strike fighter, firmly an offensive weapon. With range as the primary concern, weight was kept to a minimum through the use of extra super duralumin, an advanced aluminium alloy. Like the Spitfire, the wings were stressed skin, but unlike the early Spitfires, the A6Ms mounted twin Type 99 20mm cannons along with their machine guns. The name Zero comes from the year it entered service, 1940. In a Japanese calendar, this is the year 2600, so the A6M2 became the Type 0 Model 21, the Rai-sen Zero fighter. It was given the Allied codename Zeke, and these were sort of used interchangeably. The A6M2's engine, a Nakajima Sake 12 radial, only put out around 950 horsepower, a relatively low figure compared to contemporaries. Despite this, the aircraft's performance was unmatched, especially in a dogfight, and boasted a range of 1,160 miles, around 1,870 kilometers. It was the perfect carrier-based fighter, and had earned itself a reputation of being the most dangerous fighter in the Pacific theatre, and it was about to come up against the most dangerous Allied fighter from Europe, the Spitfire Mark V. Compared to the Mark I Spits that had flown in the Battle of Britain, the Mark V had a whole host of improvements, but the big ticket item was an enhanced Merlin 46 engine pumping out some 1,210 horsepower and boasting a single-stage supercharger optimised for high-altitude performance against incoming bombers. At 18,000 feet or above, the Merlin 46 put out an extra 200 horsepower, making the Spitfire V even more formidable. To be specific, the Australian Spitfires were Mark V Cs, the C referring to the universal C-type wing, which could mount either 8 303 machine guns, 4 20mm Hispano cannon, or 4 machine guns and 2 cannon. All the Australian aircraft had the mixed armament load, 4 303s and 2 20mm. The RAAF's aircraft were Mark V-C Tropicals, or Trops. These were adapted for warm weather and dusty operations, with the iconic Vokes air filter under the chin. Other additions included a 1.5-gallon water tank behind the pilot's seat, emergency tools, survival equipment, and a signal pistol. The Spitfire had been far more agile than the Bf-109s it flew against during the Battle of Britain, making tighter turns and losing less speed as it did so, allowing Spitfire pilots to get behind their German adversaries. However, the A6M2 Zero was shorter, lighter, and had a larger wingspan than the Spitfire. This vastly lower wing loading meant that the Japanese aircraft was far more manoeuvrable than its British counterpart, and the Australian pilots would have to adapt quickly. But the Spitfire, boasting its larger, supercharged engine, was faster, especially at high altitude. It could also dive faster than its Japanese adversary, while the 20mm Hispano cannons in the wings fired at a much higher velocity than the Japanese cannons, had a faster fire rate, and had more ammunition. The 5C mounted 4 machine guns, while the A6M2 only had 2. The Spitfire pilots also enjoyed self-sealing fuel tanks and armour plating, but in pursuit of lighter weight and increased manoeuvrability, the Japanese designers had done away with all of that nonsense. Another key difference was the range of these two aircraft. The Spitfire had been designed as a high-altitude bomber interceptor, and it had performed this role admirably during the Battle of Britain. However, it had a maximum range of less than 500 miles. It carried just over half the fuel of the Zero and was significantly heavier. This might have been okay for showing Jerry Watt 4 over the channel, but in the wide expanses of the Pacific, it was going to make life extremely difficult. So, to summarise, the Spitfire and Zero were, on paper, very evenly matched. The Spitfire was faster in a straight line, had a higher service ceiling, could dive faster, had a much more capable armament suite, and was more rugged. The Zero, meanwhile, could accelerate faster, was more manoeuvrable, and boasted far superior range. That's assuming, of course, that both aircraft were working properly, but we'll discuss that later. For now, a word from this video's sponsor, War Thunder. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and is available right now for free on PC, consoles and mobile devices. Immerse yourself in intense vehicular combat, taking command of any of 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters or ships from 10 major nations, from the goofy-looking armoured cars and biplanes of the 1920s to the cutting-edge missile-slinging fighter jets and main battle tanks of today. The vehicle details, graphics and sounds are all incredibly realistic. War Thunder has one of the most sophisticated vehicle damage models in gaming, and is incredibly satisfying to see exactly what happened to your unlucky foe with the X-ray damage view. Despite the high level of simulation, War Thunder is incredibly well optimized, running well on even lower end machines and requiring no extra equipment. You can play with a keyboard and mouse, a controller, even your phone. 70 million of us play the game already, so what are you waiting for? There's no better game for fans of military history. Join using the links below and receive a bonus pack for both new and returning players on PC and consoles that haven't played for 6 months. You get in-game currency, premium account time, boosters and more, along with a premium Sherman and Warhawk to test out. It would be a shame to miss it. But for now, back to Darwin. As the Australians waited for their Spitfires and pilots to arrive, the Japanese aviators continued to sporadically raid Darwin and the surrounding area. The A6M2 Zero pilots among them were from a unit known as the 202nd Kotukai. These were the men that the Spitfires would be up against, and this was not their first taste of combat. After extensive operations over China as part of the 3rd Kotukai, they had smashed American targets in the Philippines before moving on to Dutch and Australian aircraft over the Dutch East Indies. Between December 1941 and March 1942, the men of the 3rd had claimed 150 aerial victories and 50 aircraft destroyed on the ground for the loss of only 14 pilots, and as they began to fly regular missions from their airbase in Kopang over the water to Darwin in March 1942, these Zero pilots were among the best in the world. Highly trained, motivated and disciplined, with many having over 1,000 hours of combat experience. They were pulled away around August to support the extremely bloody campaign for Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, before being reformed as the 202nd Kotukai in late 1942 and based, once again, in Kopang, ready to mount their assault. The Spitfire pilots, much like the Zero pilots, were all very experienced aviators, grizzled veterans of the Battle of Britain, except they weren't. There were 3 squadrons collected from Europe to fly in Australia's Spitfire wing, 54, 452 and 457. The latter 2 were obvious choices as they were 2 of the 4 Australian Eats fighter squadrons and the only 2 flying Spitfires, but they had formed in early 1941. 54 Squadron was a regular RAF squadron that had indeed fought the Luftwaffe in 1940. However, RAF doctrine at the time, the opposite of the Japanese doctrine, was to send the experienced pilots to training units, so only a portion of combat veterans remained in 54. The 1st Air Wing would be led by an Australian ace, Wing Commander Clive Killer Caldwell. Caldwell had fought in North Africa in 1941 and 1942, claiming 22 aerial victories against German and Italian aircraft, and earning himself a DFC and bar. He was the first Eats graduate to ever lead a squadron, and when he reached Darwin, he was just 31 years old. So, in the red corner we have a highly manoeuvrable, long-range carrier fighter flown by some of the most overworked but experienced airmen of the time period. In the blue corner, a fast, high-altitude interceptor, the pride of Britain, and at the controls a ragtag bunch of Aussies and Brits who probably would have rather remained in Europe. So, who came out on top? Number 1 Fighter Wing arrived in Northern Australia in January 1943 and deployed into various airstrips dotted along Stewart Highway. 54 Squadron moved into RAAF Darwin, 452 into Strauss, and 457 into Livingston. There were a number of other squadrons deployed along Stewart, 2 squadrons of Hudsons at Hughes, Bowfighters at Coomaley Creek, a Vengeance Squadron at Batchelor, American B-24s at Fenton, and Dutch B-25s at McDonald. Many of these vulnerable airstrips would end up being targeted by the Japanese over the coming months. In February 1943, the Spitfires assumed sole responsibility for defending the region as the last of the P-40s moved elsewhere. First blood was on the 6th of February when Flight Lieutenant Bob Foster from No. 54 Squadron closed in on a Ki-46 Dina recon aircraft, putting 5 bursts of cannon and machine gun fire into it and sending it spiralling aflame into the Timor Sea. On the 26th, they were alerted the Japanese aircraft had moved from Kendari to Kopang, clearly preparing for a raid. A preemptive strike in Kopang by 31 Squadron's Bowfighters on the 28th caught a number of aircraft on the ground, blunting the attack before it could be launched. The Japanese didn't appreciate this, launching a quick counterattack on the 2nd of March. These 21 Zeros were detected by radar some 120 miles from Darwin, and 26 Spitfires launched to intercept, climbing quickly to maintain their advantage over the nimble A6M2s that had, somehow, disappeared from radar. The men at Livingston Field had just watched 12 Spitfires take off and head north. The next thing they saw was 21 Zeros heading south, flying fast and low. The Zeros soon hit the Beaufighter squadron at Crumilly Creek, catching one aircraft on the runway and destroying it completely before withdrawing northwards over Strauss. The Spitfires had been sent all over the place in an attempt to find the Zeros as they exited the area, and in the end only 6 aircraft were in position to intercept them when they were picked up by radar some 20 miles out to sea. Wing Commander Caldwell and his 5 Spitfires had been in the air for 90 minutes at this point and were low on fuel. The 6 aircraft formed up line astern and began their attack run on the enemy formation, outnumbered more than 3 to 1. Screeching down from altitude, he executed a 90-degree deflection shot on a group of 6 Zeros before the other Japanese aircraft descended on them and a tense dogfight ensued. It was at this moment that Caldwell decided to test the capabilities of the A6M2 before quickly exiting the melee in a full-power dive. Somehow, all 6 Spitfires made it out intact, but 2 had been damaged and all were dangerously low on fuel. Caldwell had only been in combat with the Zero for a few minutes at most, but reported afterwards, "The Spitfire was a superior aircraft generally, though less manoeuvrable at low speeds. In straight and level flight and in the dive, the Spitfire appears faster. Though the angle of climb of the Zeke is steeper, the actual gaining of height seems the same, the Spitfire going up at a lesser angle but at a greater forward speed, an advantage. I believe that at altitudes above 20,000 feet, the Spitfire, in relation to the Zeke, is an even more superior aircraft." I'm not sure what kind of maniac takes such accurate notes in the middle of a dogfight, but I'm grateful to have them. As the weather began to clear, Japanese reconnaissance activity increased, with another Dina shot down on the 7th of March by 457 Spitfires. On March 15th, it all kicked off. A recon aircraft was detected on radar, but as the aircraft overflew the island, it was revealed to actually be some 45 enemy planes. 26 Zeros, escorting 19 G4M Betty medium bombers from the 753rd Kokukai. Oops. Spitfires were extremely hastily scrambled. The wing was going to try and combine into one large formation, the mythical Big Wing. They planned to do this over Hughes Airfield, but this meant 54 Squadron had to fly away from the incoming aircraft, which was hardly ideal. Caldwell was ill that day, unable to lead the wing. In his place was Squadron Leader Ray Thorold Smith of 452 Squadron, who had been up at Darwin taking night fighter training and had been preparing to transit back to Strauss when the wing was scrambled. When it became clear that the enemy was closing in, the Big Wing rendezvous was abandoned. Spitfires were told to just climb as fast as possible in whatever formations they found themselves in. This meant the interceptors formed a long, ragged line led by Thorold Smith. He spotted the enemy as they approached Darwin Harbour at around 23,000 feet. Thorold Smith's original 5-man formation had been reduced to 3, as 2 of its pilots had been forced to turn back due to a shortage of oxygen. Their tanks had not been refilled after their training. Ray Thorold Smith chose to attack regardless. Both his wingmen were attacked, bounced by Zeros before they even reached the bombers, as were 7 Spitfires of 54 Squadron behind him who were racing to join the fray. Bert Cooper was shot down and killed, while Al Moore claimed the Spitfire's first Zero kill. More Spitfires soon joined the dogfight, attempting to get close to the Bettys, but instead getting engaged by Zeros. Clive Lloyd was forced to bail out of his stricken machine, while Frank Varney crash-landed, later dying in the hospital he had attempted to land next to. Meanwhile, the 19 G4Ms dropped their bombs with pinpoint accuracy, smashing Darwin's naval oil tanks before wheeling around and heading back out to sea. Japanese records show that at some point, 4 Spitfires managed to get through the Zero screen and hit the bombers, damaging 8 of the enemy aircraft. The Bettys had expended some 1,570 cannon rounds and 10,130 machine gun rounds trying to fend off these 4 pilots. As the dust settled and everyone returned to base, it became clear that it had not been a good day for the wing, especially when Thorold Smith failed to return. His Spitfire would not be found until 1986, resting at the bottom of Darwin Harbour. Caldwell later criticised Thorold Smith for not properly forming up the wing, and some historians believe his near-suicidal attack on the Bettys was a symptom of poor decision-making as a result of oxygen starvation. The final tally on March 15th was 4 Spitfires lost, 3 pilots killed, 1 Zero downed, and 8 bombers damaged. 8 Spitfire pilots had returned with the same complaint: their cannons had jammed. This would be a defect the Spitfires would not be able to shake off. At high altitudes, the oil in the cannons would congeal, jamming the guns. This had been solved back in England by piping some of the engine exhaust directly into the wing, but the Aussie Spitfires were a good bit older. Some had functional steel piping, some had dodgy aluminium piping, and some had no piping at all. Spare parts were months away at best. But there was a silver lining. An Australian ship had been nearby the crash site of the Zero and had recovered the wingtip, which was then used as the optimistic kill board for 54 Squadron. Lovely. The Japanese did not reappear for some 6 weeks, as they had just launched the massive Operation I-Go on April 1st. This caused great distress to the Spitfire pilots, as they were bored. But they drilled and practiced and prepared. They wanted revenge, and they'd get their chance on the 2nd of May. 25 Bettys, 27 Zeros, and 34 Spitfires scrambling to intercept. This time the Spitfires, led by Caldwell, were assembled over Hughes, climbing for altitude as a single unit. Caldwell was not going to make the same mistake as Thorold Smith, and wanted to ensure he had an altitude advantage before attacking. The Bettys dropped their bombs on Darwin airfield from 25,000 feet, with Zeros covering them from an eye-watering 31,000 feet. Caldwell reached 33,000 feet and turned to attack. The Bettys at this point very rudely began to dive for the shore, with the Spitfires closing in at the rather slow pace of a mile a minute. Combat began some 60 miles from the Darwin coast. Immediately, Caldwell lost 4 Spitfires to engine failures. The initial attack runs weren't successful either, with Gordon Gifford being shot down and killed. Caldwell pressed on, and around him the same series of events seemed to be happening over and over. A Spitfire would begin an attack run, attempt to fire, experience some kind of weapon failure, and then would be pounced upon by 1 or more Zeros. Of the 11 pilots who fired their guns and made kill claims on the 2nd of May, only 2 did not experience weapon failures. The Spits in the end claimed 10 kills, but in reality every single Japanese aircraft made it back to base. Meanwhile, Caldwell's wing had lost 14 Spitfires. Only 4 of these losses were in combat. 4 had experienced engine failures, 5 ran out of fuel, and 1 crashed, killing pilot A.C. McNabb. Somehow, only McNabb and Gifford were killed on the 2nd of May, despite the loss of so many aircraft. The Japanese, meanwhile, were jubilant, with the headline of the May 6th edition of the Nippon Times reading, "Port Darwin Raid Terrifies Anzacs." Poor show of Spitfires causes heated discussions. Blame is put on bad weather. The question of why the Spitfires, claimed by the anti-Axis camp to be the best fighter plane in the world, failed to show their power in air combats in the May the 2nd raid, has become the centre of much heated discussion in Australia. Brutal. But the fact that only 2 pilots had been lost meant that the wing was very much still ready to fight, and soon the Spitfire pilots were provided with a memo on tactics. Pilots should concentrate on relatively easy low deflection shots. Manoeuvring with Zeros is to be avoided. Dive and zoom attacks are preferred. Numerical disadvantages are acceptable, as the Spitfire has the ability to disengage when necessary. Short engagements were necessary due to fuel concerns, and line abreast 4s would be the new tactical formation. But the next skirmish would not even occur over Darwin. Join me as we travel to the magical Milingimbi Island, where flights of Spitfires from 457 Squadron have been deployed in response to Japanese bombing. In the first engagement on the 9th of May, 5 Spitfires were bounced during a climb by 9 Zeros, with 1 Spitfire and 2 Zeros shot down in the dogfight, and another Spit lost to engine failure. On the 28th, 7 Spitfires engaged a flight of 9 Bettys and 7 Zeros. 2 Spitfires lost at the cost of 4 Bettys for the Japanese. I hope you've picked up on the bizarre rate of engine failures for these Spitfires. This was because of something known as a Constant Speed Unit, or CSU. This unit automatically adjusted the pitch of the Spitfire's propeller to maintain optimal engine RPM at varying speeds and altitude. It was a big part of why the Spitfire was such an excellent dogfighter. However, if you're flying at high altitude for a long time and are not moving the throttle very often, say, for example, you're trying to chase an enemy formation, the CSU will freeze up. When you attempt to adjust the throttle with a frozen CSU, the engine will, for lack of a better word, explode.
Wasn't this built so the front wouldn't fall off?
Well, obviously not.
How do you know?
Well, because the front fell off.
But unfortunately, there was not much they could do about it. The pattern of these first raids and interceptions would continue for the rest of the summer. 20th of June saw a raid by Japanese Army aircraft, 18 Ki-49 Helens and 9 Ki-48 Lilies, escorted by 22 Ki-43 Oscars, targeting the stores area at RAAF Darwin. 2 Helens were destroyed, with another written off on landing, with 2 Spitfires and their pilots killed. Almost every Spitfire pilot, again, reported one or both of his cannons jamming. The naval pilots returned on the 27th, 9 Bettys and 27 Zeros from the 202nd. 42 Spitfires scrambled to intercept, but Caldwell's insistence on the wing forming up and poor navigation meant only 14 Spitfires, all from 457, would make it into the battle, one almost immediately suffering a CSU failure and crash landing. 2 other Spitfires would be damaged, with 1 Betty lost. On the 30th, the Navy tried again, after a Dina recon plane spotted the B-24 base at Fenton, 80 miles south of Darwin. 23 Bettys and 27 Zeros were intercepted by 39 Spitfires, who actually had time to form up this time due to how far south the target was. This advantage was more than offset by the increasing amount of technical problems. The CSU and cannon issues were now being supplemented by general wear and tear of the Spitfire's engines after 6 months of heavy use. On the 30th, 4 Spitfires would be shot down and 3 would be lost to mechanical failures along with 2 pilots. 3 B-24s were destroyed on the ground, and no Japanese aircraft were lost, despite 9 Bettys suffering some damage. An almost identical raid followed on the 6th of July, 21 Bettys and 26 Zeros targeting Fenton. 33 Spitfires took off and 30 made it to the intercept, same old story. 5 Spits lost to CSU failures, 5 lost in combat, 3 pilots killed. 1 B-24 destroyed in the ground, along with a large fuel dump, and 1 Betty shot down, with another 2 crashing on landing. The raid on the 13th of August was a bit different. It was flown at night. 12 Bettys flew over unescorted, which would prove to be the template for the autumn of 1943, sort of bomber-only nuisance raids as the fighters were needed elsewhere. On the 17th of August, though, the Spitfires would have a pretty big victory, intercepting and shooting down 4 Ki-46 Dinas as they snooped over Darwin. The Japanese again did not enjoy this and sent the next 2 Dinas over with an escort of 36 Zeros. 36 Spitfires climbed to engage, but one of their radios had been left transmitting, meaning that nobody could communicate. 3 Spitfires were lost along with 1 pilot, with 1 Zero and its pilot also lost. This combat on the 7th of September would be the last time the Spitfires would engage the Zeros over Northern Australia, but it would not be their last victory. That would come on the 11th of November, when Spitfire night fighters were vectored towards 8 Bettys. Flight Officer Jack Smithson opened up on one of the bombers with a fully functional weapon suite, downing the Betty and killing 2 senior commanders. Following this loss, the bombing raids over Darwin were immediately cancelled, and this marked the end of the Darwin campaign. So let's start with the stats. During 1943, No. 1 Fighter Wing lost 38 Spitfires and 15 pilots. The Japanese lost 5 Zeros, 1 Oscar, and 6 pilots.
Alright, we call it a draw.
But we must remember that it was not just Spitfires and Zeros in the air. No. 1 Fighter Wing also destroyed 6 Dinas, 9 Bettys, and 3 Helens, killing between 70 and 90 Japanese airmen. We also have to view these Japanese losses with a pinch of salt. Who knows how many of the battle-damaged aircraft that made it back to base were written off after the fact? Not us, at least not me. It's perhaps tempting for us to write off the Japanese fighter-on-fighter superiority and blame it on the Spitfire's technical problems, jammed cannons and CSU failures. But this would be difficult to justify. It was clear that the Japanese pilots were better disciplined, better organised and more experienced, flying together as a cohesive unit and quickly manoeuvring to protect one another in combat. The only hope for the Spitfire in a dogfight against the Zero were boom and zoom diving attacks, resulting in high speed, high deflection shots that were very difficult to pull off. The climbing required to execute these attacks also used a lot of fuel, while operating at those high altitudes made engine and cannon failures almost inevitable. The Spitfire pilots were too rigid and relied too heavily on being told what was happening over their radios, while the Zero pilots seemed to enjoy far superior situational awareness. This rigidity is perhaps shown best in the continued attempts to deploy the big wing doctrine in Darwin when it clearly was not working. While attempting it, the Spitfires would spend too much time forming up, wasting fuel as the oil in their guns and CSUs slowly congealed. Even on the few occasions when the big wing was able to be formed up like some big green and grey megazord, it was far too easy to see, and despite Caldwell's best attempts, difficult to wield properly against the wily Japanese aircraft. And yes, if the Spitfire's cannons and engines actually worked properly, we may have seen a few more Zeros spiralling into the Timor Sea. But you don't really need cannons to shoot down a Zero, you need cannons to shoot down bombers. On the 20th of June, for example, Spitfire pilots successfully made 30 separate attack runs on Japanese bombers, but only managed to shoot down 2 of them. This illustrates how ineffective rifle caliber machine guns were against these aircraft, and if the Spitfires involved had functional Hispano cannons, the results would almost certainly have been disastrous for the Japanese. Regardless, by the end of 1943, the Spitfire pilots were becoming more adept. They were gaining much needed experience and were getting significantly better at intercepting Japanese formations. If this dogfight episode had continued into 1944, we might have seen much closer duels between the Spitfires and Zeros, especially as the Spitfire Mark VCs were phased out for the greatly improved Spitfire Mark 8s in April, but we simply don't know. The pilots of No. 1 Wing had a relatively quiet end to the war. 452 and 457 squadrons were replaced in Darwin by 548 and 549, both regular RAF units. The Aussie squadrons would go into 80 Fighter Wing and were deployed in preparation for an assault on the Japanese mainland that would never happen. Meanwhile, the 202nd Kochukai was busy, being deployed to Rabaul, fighting night fighter defense missions and engaging American bombers and carrier wings in the Central Pacific until its dissolution in July 1944. With some parts of the unit continuing to fly missions over Okinawa and Japan until the very end of the war. We will never truly know which aircraft was superior. Like all dogfight videos, there are many factors at play that allow me to very smugly say that there was perhaps no real winner. However, in this instance, it was clear that the Spitfires were outmatched, both in tactics and in design. Would it have been different if the Spitfires had no technical faults? Maybe. Personally, my love for the Supermarine Spitfire and Mitsubishi Zero has only increased in making this video, and the bravery and resilience that was shown over Darwin in 1943 was truly breathtaking. Again, thanks to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to sign up for free on PlayStation, Xbox, PC or mobile using the link in the pinned comment or description to get that massive bonus pack. Make sure not to miss it. And make sure to check out the first 2 dogfight episodes, MiGs vs Sabres and Mirages vs Harriers. Any ideas for the next one are heavily encouraged. Like the video if you enjoyed, and subscribe to see the next one. I'll see you then.